A simple woman was mocked and thrown out of her interview. Then they learned her husband was the CEO. Have you ever been so underestimated that someone laughed at you right out the door before they even knew your name? The city was alive that morning, horns blaring, high heels clicking against cold concrete, and the rhythmic buzz of elevators shuttling the important up to the top floors. That's where they kept the views, the power, and the people they said mattered. On the 47th floor of a glass tower in Midtown, a corporate hiring board was sipping coffee from branded mugs, preparing for a round of interviews for a senior analyst position. Ivy League resumes were stacked like trophies. Every candidate wore armor, tailored suits, rehearsed smiles, practiced charm. And then came her. Emma Bryant didn't look the part, not even close. Her coat was thrifted, her shoes were scuffed, and her resume wasn't on premium paper. She walked into the lobby like someone trying not to be noticed. Her hair was pinned back with the kind of care you give when there's no time for elegance, just enough to be presentable. She clutched a faded brown handbag like it held everything she owned, and maybe it did. To the receptionist, she looked like someone lost. To the assistant, like someone in the wrong building. To the executives behind the frosted doors, she looked like a mistake. Emma sat quietly in the waiting room, surrounded by candidates speaking fluent buzzwords. Synergy, disruption, vertical integration. She didn't join in. She stared out the window, watching the morning light crawl across the skyline. Her hands stayed folded in her lap. Inside the boardroom, the lead interviewer, Greg Landon, scrolled through the list of candidates. Ivy, Yale, MIT. Then he paused. Emma Bryant, he muttered. No academic pedigree, a 10-year employment gap. Last listed job, cashier. His laugh was quick and condescending. Must be a walk-in, he said. The others chuckled. When she was called in, she stood slowly, straightening her jacket. She walked into the room with quiet resolve. They didn't offer her a seat at first. One man actually looked behind her, expecting a mistake to correct itself. She introduced herself in a soft but clear voice. Landon barely concealed his smirk. Emma, is it? I'm afraid this position requires extensive experience in forecasting and operations analytics. I don't see that reflected on your resume. I understand, she said, still standing. Another board member chimed in. It says here you've been out of work for over a decade. What have you been doing in that time? Raising a child. My husband was deployed, so I stayed home, she said. But I've stayed current, taught myself every major analytics platform, built models for local nonprofits, even helped restructure a logistics pipeline for a regional food bank. There was a pause, a brief flicker of interest, but it was short-lived. Look, Landon said, leaning back, we're looking for someone who can hit the ground running in a high-pressure environment. This company moves fast. We don't have time to train someone up from zero. I'm not at zero, Emma replied, calm. I've just been working somewhere you don't look. He waved a dismissive hand. Let's not waste anyone's time. She nodded slowly. All right. And just like that, she turned and walked out. No argument, no pleading, just a nod and a thank you. The door clicked shut behind her, but someone else was watching. Downstairs, in a black town car idling at the curb, a man in a sharp suit stared up at the 47th floor with narrowed eyes. He'd dropped her off himself that morning, saying only, "Be yourself. That's more than enough." Now as Emma emerged from the building, shoulders square, eyes unreadable, he stepped out of the car and handed her a coffee. How'd it go? They didn't want to hear me, she said simply. Didn't even ask a real question. He nodded, silent, but his jaw tightened. Come on, he said. There's someone I want you to meet. The man's name was Daniel Bryant, and while no one in that boardroom knew it yet, he wasn't just her husband. He was also the founder and majority shareholder of the very company that had just turned her away. Emma didn't need his help. That wasn't what this was about. She hadn't told him to intervene, and he hadn't planned to. Until now. Back upstairs, the interviewers were already resetting the room for the next candidate when a phone rang. It was Greg's assistant. There's a visitor in the lobby, she said, voice suddenly nervous. Says his name is Daniel Bryant, and he's on his way up. Landon went pale. The name hit like a sledgehammer. Because Daniel Bryant wasn't just a name, they'd all read about him in Forbes, seen him in business magazines. He was the reclusive architect of their entire operations strategy, a legend within the company, a man no one had seen in person in over a year. And now, he was coming. Coming for what, none of them yet knew, but they would find out soon. And it would be the last time any of them underestimated the woman they just laughed out of the room. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you angry, proud, or reminded you of someone who's been overlooked for far too long, then stay with us. This story is just getting started. Like, comment, and subscribe to Brave Narratives for more true power stories where justice finds a voice and the underestimated rise. The elevator chimed as it reached the 47th floor, a sound as common as breathing in a place like this. But today, it felt heavier, sharper. The boardroom had grown strangely quiet. Greg Landon adjusted his tie, a sheen of sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the air conditioning. No one said it aloud, but every person in the room was thinking the same thing. Why is Daniel Bryant here? The door opened, and in walked the man they hadn't seen in over a year. Daniel didn't move with flash or fanfare. He wore a simple gray suit, no tie, and carried only a folder tucked under one arm. But the way he walked, measured, direct, made the room shrink. Conversations died in throats. Coffee cups were quietly lowered. He didn't offer greetings or handshakes, just a glance around the table before settling his gaze on Greg. "I need 10 minutes, Daniel said. "Everyone stays." Greg tried to stand, to greet him with a polished smile, but Daniel's look told him to sit, and he did. Daniel dropped the folder on the table. No preamble, no warning. "Earlier this morning," he began, "you turned away a candidate named Emma Bryant. I'd like to know why." One of the board members cleared his throat, glancing at Greg, who squirmed under the spotlight. "Her resume lacked the experience we typically look for," he said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had held during the interview. "She didn't meet our qualification." Daniel didn't raise his voice, but the room grew colder. "Did anyone read the case study she submitted?" Silence. She attached a full logistics optimization breakdown for a nonprofit food bank that cut waste by 40% and increased delivery efficiency in a 5-county region. "Did anyone read it?" A nervous shuffle. A few head shakes. Daniel's fingers tapped once on the folder. "How about the Tableau model she built? The predictive analytics dashboard for rural supply chains?" "No?" Greg tried to recover, gesturing weakly. "Mr. Bryant, with all due respect, we get dozens of applicants a day. We follow protocol." Her background didn't indicate the level of senior-level leadership we were looking for. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "And how many of those applicants built functioning logistics systems without a degree, while raising a child alone and teaching themselves 6 enterprise platforms on their own time?" Greg opened his mouth, then shut it. Daniel opened the folder and slid a few pages across the table. "These are her models, built without a team, without funding, and they're better than half the proposals your own analytics team has produced in the last quarter." One woman on the board reached for the papers, her brow furrowing as she scanned the data. Her mouth opened slightly. This is clean work," she murmured. "Really clean." Daniel nodded. "Emma doesn't need this job, but I wanted to see who this company had become. And now I know." He stood. The silence in the room had become suffocating. Then Daniel looked straight at Greg. "You judged her based on her clothes, her resume format, her tone. You didn't ask her a single meaningful question. You saw a woman, a mother, and made assumptions. You mocked her. Laughed." Greg's voice came out like a creak. "Mr. Bryant, we didn't know she was your—" "That's exactly the problem," Daniel interrupted. "You shouldn't have needed to." His eyes swept the rest of the board. "This isn't about favoritism. This is about vision. We claim to be innovators, disruptors, yet you turned away someone who outperformed your expectations because she didn't look the part." He walked toward the door. "That ends now." As he stepped out, the room remained frozen. Back in the car, Emma sipped her coffee in silence. She hadn't asked what happened upstairs, and Daniel hadn't offered. She didn't need him to explain. She'd felt the change in the wind the moment he stepped out of the car, but she hadn't asked him to do it. That mattered to her. "You didn't have to go up," she said finally. "I didn't go for you," Daniel replied quietly. "I went for the people after you, so they don't get laughed out of a room for being underestimated." Emma looked out the window again. The city moved around them, fast, loud, relentless. But for a moment, inside the car, everything was still. Far above them, behind the same frosted doors, the board sat in stunned silence. One of them finally spoke. "We made a mistake." Greg didn't answer. He was still staring at the door, like it might open again and finish what it started. But Daniel wasn't coming back. He didn't need to. The message had landed like a lightning strike, and the storm that followed would be theirs to weather. If you've ever been looked down on because of how you dress, how long you've been out of work, or because you didn't fit their mold, then you know how Emma felt in that room. Keep watching, because this is only the beginning. Like, comment, and subscribe to Brave Narratives for more stories where the underestimated rise, and the powerful get reminded who they're dealing with. The fallout didn't wait for the next board meeting. By the time Daniel and Emma had left the building, the company's internal messaging system was already buzzing. Rumors turned into whispers, whispers into frantic phone calls. People in departments far removed from hiring were hearing the story. How the CEO had personally walked in and shut down an interview. How a woman no one had taken seriously had sent the entire executive floor into silence. In HR, the director was scrolling through the interview notes, eyes wide as she read the dismissive comments written by Greg. Not a culture fit, low confidence, no edge. Another tab showed Emma's attached portfolio. The director clicked through the documents, her expression changing from detached to stunned. These were not beginner materials. These were polished, actionable frameworks. And worst of all, she hadn't even been granted a second round. Meanwhile, upstairs, Greg was sweating through his shirt. His authority, once unquestioned, was now under scrutiny. Two board members pulled him aside in the hallway. "You need to fix this," one said flatly. "You embarrassed us." But it was too late for damage control. Daniel had made his move publicly, deliberately, and word was spreading to stakeholders who never cared about hiring decisions before. Investors had called. Partners had emailed. Who is Emma Bryant, they wanted to know, and why was she treated like she didn't belong in her own husband's company? But Emma didn't want revenge. She didn't even want the job anymore. Back home, she sat at their modest kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her. Ash-colored light filtered through the blinds. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. She wasn't thinking about the humiliation, not exactly. She was thinking about the thousands of women like her, with 10-year gaps on their resumes, with brilliant minds buried under domestic routines, overlooked because they didn't speak the language of boardrooms. She started typing. It wasn't a resignation letter. It was a proposal, an internal initiative, a pipeline, designed for people exactly like her, candidates with non-traditional experience, with battle-tested resourcefulness. She called it Project Reentry, not just a training program, but a talent accelerator. Emma didn't ask Daniel to back it. She just sent it to him and went back to washing dishes. He opened it on his phone later that night. Didn't say a word until he'd read every page. Then, quietly, he slid the phone across the counter and looked at her. "We're going to build this," he said, "top to bottom. Your way." The next morning, Daniel sent Emma's proposal to the executive team. No introduction, no explanation, just the plan, and her name at the top. Then he waited. By mid-morning, the buzz started again, but this time it wasn't scandal. It was momentum. Quiet nods of respect. The head of analytics forwarded it with one line. "This is exactly what we should have been doing 5 years ago." But not everyone was clapping. Greg called an emergency meeting that afternoon. He pitched it as a strategic discussion on hiring protocols, but everyone knew what it was: his last attempt to regain control. "This sets a dangerous precedent," he said, pacing the boardroom. "We can't just start hiring people because they're married to executives. It looks bad." One of the board members raised an eyebrow. "Greg, we didn't reject her because she was too close. We rejected her because you didn't even give her a chance. She lacked experience. She built predictive models better than your team," the CFO snapped. That wasn't a resume, it was a warning shot. Greg's voice cracked with frustration. So, we're just rewriting the hiring rulebook because of one mistake? No, someone said from the doorway. It was Emma. She wasn't supposed to be there, but Daniel had forwarded her the meeting link, and after 10 minutes of watching Greg rewrite the narrative, she walked in. "You're not rewriting the rulebook," she said. "You're finally reading the whole thing." For a moment, no one moved. Greg tried to recover. "This is a private..." "No, Greg, it's a leadership review, and I think we all need to see clearly now." She held up a copy of her proposal. "This isn't about me getting a job. This is about changing who gets seen. You filtered me out before I ever spoke, but how many others have you missed?" The room stayed silent. Emma placed the packet on the table and turned to leave. But this time, someone stood. The head of HR. "Emma, stay," she said. "We want to hear more." And just like that, the tide shifted, because in that moment, she wasn't just Daniel Bryant's wife. She wasn't just a mom with a gap on her resume. She was the first person in the room who had actually brought an idea that moved people. If you've ever walked into a room and felt invisible, if you've been told you weren't good enough without anyone asking who you really are, then you know what Emma stood for in that moment. And her story's just warming up. Stick around. Like, comment, and subscribe for more stories where the underestimated don't just rise, they rebuild the rules. The conference room had never felt that still before. Emma didn't sit down, but she stayed. She stood at the end of the table while seasoned executives turned toward her, not with pity, not with condescension, but with the quiet realization that she had something they couldn't fake: real-world clarity, applied intelligence, and the courage to speak truth to power in a room designed to silence people like her. The HR director motioned for her to continue. Emma breathed in slowly, nerves coiled in her gut. But she steadied herself like she had every night during years of budgeting stretched-thin groceries and figuring out school schedules solo while Daniel was deployed overseas. She clicked open the slideshow on the shared screen. "This is the gap," she said, showing a chart with lines diverging. "It's not about skills, it's about perception. Millions of people, mothers, veterans, caretakers, spend years building strategic thinking, emotional intelligence, problem-solving. But when they try to re-enter the workforce, their experience is ignored because it doesn't come with a title or a corporate logo." She moved to the next slide. "What if we didn't see them as underqualified, but underdiscovered?" There was a beat of silence. One of the younger board members, a woman who hadn't spoken much until now, leaned in. "So this program, Project Reentry, it's not charity." Emma met her gaze. "No, it's strategy, and long overdue." Then Greg scoffed. "And you're just going to run it? No degree, no certifications? You expect us to hand you a department because you married well?" There it was, the old voice, the one she'd heard in other rooms, in other tones, sometimes snide, sometimes polite, but always the same. "You don't belong." She didn't flinch. "I'm not asking for permission. I'm offering you a chance to stop bleeding potential out of your company. But if you're not ready, someone else will be." That landed. The CFO looked at Greg, then back at Emma. "How much would it cost to pilot this?" Emma didn't hesitate. "Almost nothing. We can start with internal volunteers. Training modules are already written. I've identified 10 qualified candidates who applied in the last 3 months and were filtered out for reasons unrelated to performance." She clicked again. "And here's the data from the nonprofit I helped. Same model, same metrics. 5% increase in logistics efficiency in under 90 days. No one spoke. She had the room. Fully. Daniel hadn't said a word, just watched from the side with arms crossed and a flicker of pride in his eyes. Not because he'd made her strong, but because the world was finally seeing what he'd always known. Across the table, the head of operations adjusted his glasses. "We approve pilot programs all the time. If the model works, it works, and this one has legs." The HR director nodded. "It'll need oversight, guidance, of course, but Emma, would you be willing to lead development? She didn't answer right away, not to be coy, but because she was stunned. For years, she'd sat on the other side of the wall, watching people with less grit and more gloss get opportunities. Now, they were asking her to take the wheel. "I'll need a team," she said. "One that understands what it means to rebuild from the ground up." "Then build one," the director said. "You've earned that much." But not everyone in the room clapped. Greg sat stiffly, watching it all slip away. "This isn't how things are done," he muttered. "It's not sustainable. Next thing you know, we'll be replacing our entire recruitment system based on feelings." Emma turned toward him. "This isn't about feelings. It's about being smarter. You passed on someone who had all the tools. You just didn't recognize them. And I'm betting she's not the only one." Greg opened his mouth again, but the CEO's voice cut in. Low, calm, final. "Enough." Daniel stepped forward now, his first words since the meeting began. "You had your shot to lead this company's hiring strategy. And today, you showed exactly what your instincts produce. Wasted talent, missed opportunities, and a liability in our culture. This isn't personal, it's practical. We need a new approach." Greg knew, right then, he knew his time was over. Later that day, a press release went live. Short, strategic. The company is proud to launch Project Reentry, an initiative focused on reintegrating overlooked talent into modern business environments. Led by Emma Bryant. The article didn't mention the interview. It didn't need to. The real story was already being whispered through LinkedIn inboxes and Slack messages across the industry. Something had shifted, and fast. At home that night, Emma sat with Daniel on the back porch. The city lights blinked in the distance. She curled her hands around a cup of tea and let the quiet settle. "You know they're only listening now because of you," she said softly. Daniel shook his head. "They listened because you showed up and refused to shrink. I just opened the door. You walked through it. If you've ever fought to be taken seriously, if you've ever had to prove your worth 3 times over just to be heard once, then Emma's story is yours too. And it's not done yet." Like, comment, and subscribe to Brave Narratives, where ordinary becomes unstoppable and silence gets broken for good. 3 weeks later, the first round of Project Reentry candidates walked into the same building where Emma had once stood alone, humiliated and dismissed. But today was different. The waiting room felt alive, nervous, sure, but filled with real anticipation. People who had been sidelined for years, single parents, retired service members, workers who had been laid off and never called back, were now walking through that glass tower with something they hadn't felt in a long time. A real shock. Emma greeted them one by one. She didn't wear a suit, didn't stand behind a podium. She stood beside them, clipboard in hand, remembering what it felt like to be judged before a word left your mouth. She didn't forget. She wouldn't forget. Inside the boardroom, the Project Reentry initiative had become a top-level focus. Early data showed spikes in retention, loyalty, and even innovation. The so-called underqualified were outpacing traditional hires in multiple departments. Emma had proven the theory, and now she was expanding the system, pairing candidates with mentors, retooling onboarding protocols, and building an entire side of the company that didn't just find talent, but restored dignity. The executive team was still adjusting. Some embraced it, others tolerated it, but none of them could deny it was working. Greg, on the other hand, was fading fast. After being quietly removed from hiring oversight, he was reassigned to a strategic planning role with no team and no real authority. He showed up late, left early, kept his eyes low in meetings. What stung him most wasn't just the demotion. It was watching Emma thrive in the very place he tried to push her out of. She had become a name, a movement, even outside the company. Industry publications started reaching out. Articles with headlines like, "From Stay-at-Home Mom to Strategic Director, How Emma Bryant Rewrote the Rules," began circulating. She didn't seek the attention, but it came anyway, and with it, respect. But with attention came scrutiny. One afternoon, while Emma was leading a mentorship roundtable, an email leaked. A snide internal message, written by Greg weeks earlier, before he'd been demoted, resurfaced. It had been forwarded, screenshotted, and quietly shared. In it, He called Project Reentry Emma's charity circus and suggested they let her play CEO's wife until it burns out. It was short, brutal, and enough to reignite tensions that had only just begun to cool. The message hit the media within hours. Twitter threads exploded. The company's official account went into damage control mode. Reporters began asking pointed questions. Was Emma just a figurehead? Had her rise been orchestrated? Was this really about merit or favoritism? The backlash was sharp, and it spread fast. Emma saw the message late that night, the glow of her phone casting hard shadows across her face. She didn't cry, she didn't rage, she just stared at it motionless, the silence of the room pressing in like fog. Daniel came out of the kitchen with 2 mugs and stopped when he saw the look in her eyes. She handed him the phone. He read it once, his jaw tightening. "You want me to respond?" he asked. She shook her head. "If we respond, it looks like guilt. If we don't, it looks like arrogance. Either way, they've already written the narrative." "Then write a new one," Daniel said, placing the mug beside her. "The way you always have." The next morning, Emma didn't issue a statement. She didn't go on camera or plead her case. Instead, she walked into the mentorship hall early, stood at the front, and delivered a new training module on resilience, perception, and how to navigate gatekeeping without losing yourself. She used the leaked email as an example, not of cruelty, but of what bias looks like in power. She never named Greg. She didn't have to. The people in the room understood. They saw her, standing tall despite the fire, and something clicked. She wasn't just a program director anymore. She had become the very thing the initiative was meant to protect. An unshakable example. Later that day, one of the original board members who had dismissed her pulled her aside. He was older, once skeptical, but something in him had changed. "Emma," he said, clearing his throat, "you've turned this place into something better. I didn't see it before, but I do now. Don't let them take this from you." She smiled just a little. "I'm not here to be liked. I'm here to make sure no one else walks into that waiting room thinking they're invisible." If you've ever been the target of a whisper campaign, if someone's tried to reduce your worth down to a joke or a rumor, then you know the fire Emma stood in. And you also know what it takes to stand anyway. Stay with us. Like, comment, and subscribe, where the overlooked refuse to bow, and the truth doesn't wait for permission. Later that evening, while the office lights dimmed and the building emptied out floor by floor, Emma remained seated in the quiet, glass-paneled war room she'd taken over as a temporary headquarters. She was reviewing applicant notes for the next expansion of Project Reentry, this time targeting skilled workers displaced during economic downturns. Across her screen were names, stories, dates, people who had been told no for reasons that had nothing to do with ability. She made notes beside each one, pausing not just to assess qualifications, but to understand the pattern of rejection each had endured. It was never just one reason. It was the accumulation of silence, dismissal, bias. A janitor passed the glass door and nodded. Emma smiled and waved back, and the woman hesitated, then stepped in with a shy grin. "I just wanted to say, I saw that article about you. My daughter's been trying to get back into work for years. They tell her she's too old to start over." Emma stood and placed a hand gently on the woman's arm. "Tell her not to wait for their permission," she said. "We're building something better, and she's exactly who it's for." That was the real fire behind the program. Not just second chances, but first chances for people who had never been seen properly the first time. Emma wasn't chasing titles or headlines. She was fighting to rewrite the entire system from inside the walls that once kept her out. And she wasn't backing down. The Winter Gala was supposed to be a night of corporate celebration. Suits, speeches, polished smiles under soft chandeliers. Hosted annually in the company's name, it brought together investors, executives, partners, and media, all eager to sip champagne and pat themselves on the back. But this year was different. Whispers swirled weeks before the event. Not about the earnings, not about the new expansion, but about her. Emma Bryant's name was now mentioned in circles that once would have ignored her entirely. Some were curious, others skeptical, a few outright resentful, but none could deny she had become the unexpected center of gravity in a building that once treated her like a misplaced file. When Emma walked into the ballroom, it wasn't in a glittering designer dress or with a media entourage. She wore a simple black gown, tailored just enough to fit, with a silver pin on her lapel. Project Reentry's new logo, a small flame inside a rising circle. Daniel walked beside her, but stayed deliberately to her side, letting her lead. Every step she took echoed with weight, not just from the past year, but from every silent rejection she'd ever received. Conversations paused. Eyes followed. Some smiled, some turned away. One table of execs murmured among themselves, the old guard, still clinging to the idea that they were the only ones who could dictate legacy. Emma didn't seek them out. She moved toward the stage instead, where she was scheduled to speak briefly about Project Reentry's first-year progress. The event planner had originally slotted her near the end, between donor recognitions and closing remarks. But after pressure from both the board and staff, her segment was moved to the middle, prime time. It was a quiet signal. People were finally paying attention. She stepped up, the lights casting a warm glow on her face, the hum of glasses and cutlery fading as the mic crackled to life. She didn't read from cards, she didn't speak like an executive, she spoke like someone who had lived the truth. "I wasn't supposed to be here," she began, her voice steady. "Not just tonight, ever. I wasn't supposed to make it past the front desk, past the dismissals, past the quiet smirks when they saw my name on an application." She looked around the room, slowly. "But here's the truth. I never stopped learning. I never stopped building. And neither did the thousands of others you passed over because their resumes didn't come printed on the right paper." She shared numbers, retention rates, performance metrics, innovations sparked by people previously labeled unqualified. She didn't say it to shame the room. She said it to show what was possible when value wasn't measured by pedigree alone. Then she shifted, just slightly. "I want to tell you about a man named Victor," she said. He was a forklift operator laid off during the pandemic. No college, no management experience, but during lockdown he taught himself Python on a borrowed laptop, built an inventory tracker from scratch. No one hired him, until Project Reentry brought him in. Today he's leading a warehouse automation project saving us $2,400,000 0 cents a year. The room went still. It wasn't just a good story. It was undeniable proof. She gave them 4 more stories like that. Each one real, each one pulled from the cracks of the system they had trusted blindly. And with every word, the room bent further toward her. At the back of the ballroom, Greg stood near the exit, arms folded tightly across his chest. He hadn't been invited to speak. He hadn't even been seated with the board, just an anonymous name on the attendance list, drifting near irrelevance. But as Emma spoke, he watched not just her, but the crowd. The heads nodding, the expressions shifting, the way the old guard sat stiffer now while the newer generation leaned forward. And for the first time, he understood something that scared him more than demotion. He was no longer the voice of the room. She was. Emma closed her speech with a quiet conviction. "We're not lowering standards. We're expanding the definition of potential. And if that makes people uncomfortable, good. Growth should feel uncomfortable. It means you're doing something real." She stepped down to a wave of applause. Real applause. Not the polite kind reserved for board members, but the visceral kind. The kind that rises when people feel seen. Reporters scrambled to take notes. Donors lined up to ask how they could contribute. Staff members came forward with tears in their eyes, telling her about their sisters, mothers, cousins, people who might now have a chance because of her. Later in the evening, while Daniel was pulled aside by shareholders and media reps, Emma slipped away to the edge of the hall. She stood quietly near the catering tables, sipping water, watching it all unfold from the sidelines. She didn't need to be the center of it. She just needed to know it was moving, that the tide had turned. A young intern approached her hesitantly. "Ms. Bryant," she said, nervous, "I just wanted to say, I almost didn't apply for the rotation program because I didn't think someone like me had a shot. But then I read your story. It changed something. Thank you." Emma smiled, not the kind for press photos, the kind that held gratitude and weight and memory all rolled together. "Then, don't ever wait again," she said softly. "Take the shot, even when they don't see you yet." If you've ever stood on the edge of a room wondering if you belonged, if you've ever held back because the world made you believe you weren't enough, then know this. Emma didn't rise because the doors opened for her. She rose because she refused to stop knocking. Like, comment, and subscribe, where the unseen break through, and every underdog gets their reckoning. The Monday after the gala was supposed to be business as usual, but something had shifted. Emma's speech had lit a fuse beneath more than just her own company. It had made waves across the industry. Articles from business magazines and leadership blogs exploded online, dissecting her words, praising the authenticity she brought to a corporate culture that had long grown stale with sameness. Terms like bias disruption, talent redefinition, and authentic innovation suddenly had a face attached. And that face wasn't a 20-year veteran CEO or a celebrated consultant. It was hers. A woman who had once been laughed out of an interview room now had CEOs quoting her on their company Slack channels. Internally, Project Reentry went from pilot to full integration within a week. 3 new departments signed on to adopt the model, and Emma was invited to oversee a task force aimed at implementing the system internationally. She said yes, but only under one condition. Every team must include at least one re-entry hire in a leadership pipeline. She wasn't building a moment, she was building a movement. But the higher she climbed, the more the pressure changed shape. With visibility came expectations. She began receiving thousands of emails. Some were heartfelt stories from people desperate for opportunity. Others were passive-aggressive notes disguised as professional concerns. A few even accused her of dismantling meritocracy, of promoting sympathy over skill. One executive from another firm called her project a dangerous HR experiment. She read the article quietly over coffee one morning, her fingers tightening around the mug as she scanned the same tired lines. Soft skills over results. Lowering the bar. A feel-good trend with no longevity. The words didn't surprise her. What surprised her was how numb she felt reading them. Not cold, not apathetic, just done. She didn't write a rebuttal. Instead, she wrote a proposal. That week, she pushed for the creation of an advanced performance tracking system tailored for re-entry hires, not to justify their existence, but to prove in data that potential when nurtured outperformed pedigree when left complacent. The system tracked project milestones, innovation metrics, team cohesion scores. Within 2 weeks, the first reports came in. Re-entry hires were outperforming standard hires in leadership potential, collaboration, and cross-sectional adaptability. One board member looked over the data and said quietly, "This changes everything." But not everyone was celebrating. Behind closed doors, Greg had become something of a ghost within the company. He wandered hallways with a badge that still worked, but a presence that no longer mattered. His office had been reassigned, his name removed from key email threads. He clung to the few allies he had left, whispering doubts, sowing seeds, quiet little narratives like, "She's only successful because the CEO backs her," or, "This won't last a fiscal year without falling apart." He wasn't trying to reclaim his role. He was trying to watch her stumble. But Emma wasn't stumbling. She was moving faster than ever. She started holding closed-door sessions with hiring managers from other firms, walking them through the re-entry playbook. She didn't charge fees. She didn't build a consulting empire. She shared because that's what the mission had always been, to open doors wide enough that no one else had to sit in a lobby, wondering if they even belonged in the building. And then came the call. A prestigious tech firm, bigger, richer, and far more rigid than her own, asked her to keynote their upcoming summit on innovation and talent pipelines. It was an unprecedented invitation, especially for someone without a degree, someone who hadn't been formally vetted by the usual speakers' bureaus. But they didn't ask her because she fit the image. They asked because she was the shift, the change, the proof that the system could bend without breaking. She accepted. But she didn't go alone. The night before the flight, Emma gathered 6 of the original re-entry hires. Victor, the warehouse coder, Nia, the former caregiver turned project coordinator, Hassan, the laid-off machinist turned systems analyst, and 3 others who had proven again and again what it meant to be overlooked and then rise. She didn't want to speak for them, she wanted to speak with them. The summit was massive. Lights, cameras, a sea of sleek suits and polished pitches. But when Emma walked onto that stage, flanked by 6 individuals who didn't come from Ivy League boardrooms, but from lived-in kitchens and secondhand uniforms, the room changed. People sat up, phones were lowered. She began not with numbers, but with a simple truth. Merit isn't something you inherit, she said. It's something you prove, and you can't prove it if no one's looking. Then, one by one, she passed the mic. Each re-entry hire told a piece of their story. Each one landed like thunder. By the end of the session, recruiters were lining up to ask how to bring the system into their companies. The final applause wasn't for Emma alone. It was for the people behind her, beside her, rising because someone finally made room. If you've ever been told to sit down while less qualified voices took the mic, if you've ever been made to feel like your experience didn't count, then Emma's voice was speaking to you too. Like, comment, and subscribe for more cinematic stories where the underestimated rise and the old rules get rewritten. Back at headquarters, the echo from the summit hadn't faded, it had amplified. Within days, Emma's inbox overflowed with collaboration requests, invitations to speak, and interest from foundations wanting to fund expansions of Project Reentry. But Emma wasn't chasing publicity. While others saw a wave, she saw a responsibility. She knew the real work had just begun, not in the spotlight, but in the blind spots that still existed across every level of the company. So instead of drafting speeches or flying out to industry dinners, she returned to her desk, rolled up her sleeves, and began auditing every department's hiring data. What she found wasn't surprising, but it was sobering. Entire teams had never hired a candidate with a gap longer than 2 years. Some managers had automated filters that eliminated anyone without a college degree. Others cited culture fit as justification to pass over dozens of diverse applicants. These weren't malicious decisions, they were patterns, quiet, systemic, and deeply rooted. Emma didn't send out memos or scold anyone publicly. She met with each department head one-on-one, bringing charts, case studies, and real-world success stories from their own buildings. She wasn't attacking, she was inviting them to wake up. Meanwhile, inside the walls of upper management, Greg was unraveling. The more Project Reentry succeeded, the more invisible he became. He'd tried to undermine the initiative, then tried to ignore it. Now, with Emma's influence cemented and her reach growing, he pivoted to a final, desperate tactic: sabotage. Late one night, he accessed internal records and began quietly flagging candidates in the re-entry program with false performance concerns. One candidate, a former teacher turned data specialist, was marked for termination under inconsistency. Another, a single father working in operations, was assigned late shift transfers without warning. It might have worked, except Emma had implemented an internal review protocol weeks earlier, anticipating pushback. Her team cross-checked evaluations with productivity data, and within 48 hours the flags were traced back to one origin: Greg's login. The evidence was undeniable, and this time, Daniel didn't wait. The following morning, Greg was called into a meeting. There was no boardroom drama, no raised voices, just HR, legal, and Daniel waiting in a quiet corner office. Emma wasn't there. She didn't need to be. Greg sat down, already pale, already sweating. He tried to speak, to frame it as a misunderstanding, but Daniel cut through the noise like glass through silk. You tried to bury people who finally had a chance. You didn't just cross a line, you burned it. The termination was swift. No ceremony, no severance. Just a single escorted walk out of the building where he once held sway. Greg didn't look back, and no one looked up from their desks as he passed. But Emma didn't celebrate. That afternoon, she sat alone in the back stairwell, the one she used to sneak into for quiet when she first joined. She sipped cold coffee and stared at the floor, thinking not about Greg, but about how many more like him still existed. The ones hiding behind polished smiles and empty compliments. The ones who nodded during meetings and whispered afterward. You couldn't fire them all, but you could outwork them, outlast them, outshine them, with results so clear they couldn't be denied. Later that week, Emma brought together the entire re-entry cohort for a private gathering, not a press event, just a space to check in. Some had promotions already, Others were still learning, still fighting their own doubts. One woman, who had once been a part-time cleaner and was now in supply chain analytics, stood and said, "I thought the hardest part would be proving I could do the job. Turns out, the hardest part was believing someone would give me the chance." Emma nodded. "That's why we keep building. Not just programs but proof. We turn stories into systems. We replace luck with access." Then she looked around the room and asked something she hadn't before. "If we could take this wider, statewide, even global, what would you change?" The room buzzed with ideas. Satellite offices, online training centers, partnerships with community colleges. Some even mentioned a nonprofit spin-off. Emma didn't say yes to everything, but she wrote down every idea, because once you open a door, you don't close it behind you. You hold it, you wedge it open, you build a damn bridge. That night, she went home and outlined a 5-year growth model, not just for re-entry, but for a network of reintegration programs across sectors. She called it the Second Horizon. Daniel read through the plan in silence, then handed it back to her. "You're not building a program anymore," he said. "You're building a legacy." Emma didn't smile. She nodded. Because this was never about her name. It was about everyone whose name was skipped, everyone whose story was cut short before it began. If you've ever had to claw your way back from being overlooked, if you've ever seen the doors close and decided to build a new entrance, then this fight is yours too. Like, comment, and subscribe for more stories where second chances spark revolutions, and the ones who were ignored become the ones we all look up to. It started as a soft hum, mentions on HR forums, a shout-out in a mid-tier business podcast, a few nonprofit leaders reposting Emma's summit speech. But then it caught fire. Within 2 months, Project Reentry wasn't just trending, it was transforming. Municipal governments began reaching out, asking how they could replicate the model in their public workforce programs. Community colleges wanted access to the training curriculum. Veteran transition services requested partnership frameworks. Emma had built something that cut across industries and broke down silos no one had questioned in decades. What began as a hallway proposal to fix one broken system was now reshaping the foundation of employment itself. But as the outside world caught on, inside the company, pressure built like steam behind glass. Not everyone was happy. Departments with old guard leaders resisted the change. Some believed quietly, others voiced it outright. They called it mission drift, claimed it was stretching resources thin, blamed Project Reentry for why their pet budgets didn't get approved. One division lead wrote a memo accusing Emma of running a passion project with executive protection. It was cold, calculated, and meant to spark doubt. The memo leaked. Emma didn't flinch. She'd been underestimated before, but now she had allies. Real ones. People she'd elevated who now sat at decision-making tables. The head of operations, a former skeptic turned staunch supporter, issued a company-wide statement the next morning. Project Reentry is not a detour from our core mission. It's a return to it. Results don't lie. Potential is no longer a theory. It's our competitive edge. Still, Emma knew the next step couldn't be internal. She had to take it to the public. The Second Horizon plan was ready. A full blueprint to license and export the reentry model into cities and private sectors nationwide. But instead of a media launch, Emma chose something quieter, more personal. She brought it to a town council in a working-class suburb an hour outside the city, a place where laid-off factory workers and single-income homes made survival a daily calculation. She stood in a modest room with peeling paint and a broken projector, presenting to council members who didn't wear suits and didn't pretend to care about jargon. And yet they listened closer than any board she'd ever faced. Because Emma didn't speak like she was there to sell. She spoke like someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be sitting on the other side of hope. She showed them job recovery data from Reentry's first year, talked them through scalable steps, and offered to help set up their pilot program personally, not because of publicity, but because these were the people the entire system had forgotten. One of the councilmen, a former auto mechanic, asked her point blank, "What happens when the money runs out? When the next budget's tight and we're told to cut back?" Emma looked him in the eye and didn't blink. Then, you don't cut the people, you cut the excuses. Because those folks you'd cut, they're the ones who know how to make something out of nothing. You need them more than they need a handout. The motion passed unanimously. Later that night, back in the car, Emma sat quietly in the passenger seat while the streetlights streaked across the windshield. Daniel drove, one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally reaching for hers. "You know you just started a wildfire," he said with a sideways glance. "Let it burn," Emma replied. "Let it burn down every gate they built to keep the wrong people out." But she wasn't naive. She knew backlash would come again. There would be audits, oversight boards, maybe even legal threats. But that didn't scare her anymore, because she had something stronger than compliance. Proof. Real people with real stories. Voices that couldn't be spun. Voices that couldn't be erased. A week later, Emma was invited to a televised debate on workforce innovation. She almost declined, knowing those events were more spectacle than substance. But when she saw who else was speaking, a corporate think tank rep who had once written an op-ed calling gap year workers structural risks, she changed her mind. She wasn't going to argue, she was going to show up. The debate aired live. The studio lights were harsh, the moderator poised. Her opponent wore expensive cufflinks and spoke in polished abstractions. But Emma didn't match his tone. She talked about Nia, the former caregiver who now trained new hires. She talked about Victor, who was about to be promoted again. She talked about the town that took a chance, and what happened when they did. At one point, the moderator asked, "What makes you qualified to challenge the system the rest of us were trained in?" Emma didn't hesitate. "Because I survived it, and I rebuilt it from the ground up. That's not theory, that's history." The segment went viral before it ended. If you've ever felt like the only voice in a room of doubters, if you've ever been told that you don't have the right background to make real change, then you understand exactly what Emma carried into that studio. She didn't come to compete with credentials, she came to outlast the rules. Like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories where quiet voices lead revolutions, and real-world grit outshines every polished resume. 2 months after the televised debate, Emma was on the cover of 3 major business magazines, not in designer clothes or dramatic poses, but standing in the lobby of a satellite office in one of the first cities to adopt her Second Horizon framework. Her sleeves were rolled up, a clipboard in hand, and a group of new hires standing behind her, smiling. The headline read, "Rewriting the Rules, How One Woman is Redefining the American Workforce." It was validation, but it wasn't what Emma was chasing. She didn't care about the cover, she cared about what came after. Because media momentum was fleeting, but systems stuck around. What came next tested everything. The state labor department reached out, requesting a full audit of the pilot programs now running under Project Reentry. It was standard, they said, routine, but Emma knew better. Whispers had already started. Powerful institutions that benefited from rigid pipelines were beginning to feel threatened. A few lobby-backed agencies weren't happy that a single woman had changed hiring patterns without going through their approval. One call led to another. A formal investigation was launched. Not into fraud or financial misconduct, but into standards consistency. It was their way of questioning whether giving a chance to people with unconventional backgrounds meant sacrificing quality. Emma didn't panic. She prepared. She pulled every record, every data point, every evaluation that backed the success of her hires. She didn't doctor anything, she didn't spin it, she laid it bare. And when the audit team walked in, a cluster of suits, clipboards, and guarded expressions, she welcomed them with coffee, chairs, and a smile that said, "Go ahead, try." For 3 weeks, they dissected the program. They interviewed her team, her hires, even her opponents. They requested hundreds of documents. Emma complied with every one. And when the report finally came, it landed with a force no one saw coming. Project Reentry hires outperformed their peers in reliability, innovation, and collaborative metrics. Attrition was down, morale was up, productivity had increased in every department that adopted the model. The report didn't just pass the program, it endorsed it. But that wasn't the victory. The real win came in the final paragraph, written not by a politician or a policymaker, but by one of the analysts conducting the audit. The Project Re-Entry model offers not only a compelling business case, it read, but a blueprint for how dignity and performance can coexist without compromise. Still, even with the green light, Emma knew something was missing. One night after all the meetings had quieted, she sat at her kitchen table again, the same spot where she'd once drafted the first proposal no one had asked for. She stared at a map of the country with pins where her program had launched, and then she looked at the spaces with nothing. Entire counties with zero pipelines, towns where the internet was spotty and the job market even worse. Places too small to get attention, but too big to be forgotten. That's where she needed to go next. The next morning, she made a decision that surprised everyone. She stepped down, not in failure, not under pressure, but because her mission had outgrown the company. She handed leadership of Project Re-Entry to two of its first graduates, people she'd trained, believed in, and knew would carry the torch with even more fire than she could. Emma wasn't retreating, she was pivoting. She announced the formation of her own foundation, the Second Horizon Initiative, a national organization dedicated to expanding reintegration programs beyond corporations into communities, education systems, and public policy. Reporters asked why she would walk away from the empire she'd just built. She answered simply, because it was never supposed to be mine, it was supposed to be ours. Her resignation email was short, personal, and ended with a quote she'd scribbled in a notebook years ago when she thought her story would never start. If the door won't open, build a window. If they brick up the window, bring a sledgehammer. Within hours, that quote was being posted across platforms, printed on banners, shared in hiring seminars. And Emma? She didn't go on a victory tour. She didn't publish a memoir. She drove across the state to a struggling technical college and gave her first foundation-funded lecture to a group of 18 students, half of them single parents, all of them overlooked. No cameras, no stage lights, just her, a whiteboard, and the lesson they came for. If you've ever walked away from comfort to keep chasing your purpose, if you've ever handed over the keys to something you built because it was never just about you, then you know the courage it takes to let go and keep climbing. Like, comment, and subscribe for more stories where legacy is forged not through fame, but through fire, and where real change walks quietly but shakes the ground beneath it. The early days of the Second Horizon Initiative were quiet, intentionally so. Emma refused to build another tower of bureaucracy or flashy marketing campaigns. Instead, she focused on small, tactical deployments. She partnered with libraries in low-income towns to host skill labs. She created downloadable toolkits that local organizations could adapt without needing her permission or her presence. She believed deeply that real change didn't come from centralized power. It came from seeding ideas in places no one ever thought to look. And while headlines faded, something else took hold. Word of mouth. One of the first small wins came from a public high school on the outskirts of a declining factory town. A guidance counselor downloaded Emma's toolkit and used it to create a weekend mentorship circle for students whose parents had been out of work for years. Within a month, a student who had failed twice in traditional classes rebuilt the school's inventory system using free software and was offered a paid internship by a local business. The counselor emailed Emma with 2 sentences. It worked. He believes he can do more now. That was the fuel. Emma read every one of those notes, printed them out, and kept them in a leather folder. Not to show off, not for nostalgia, but to remind herself why it had to stay personal. Even as donations came in, even as the foundation grew. But success, especially quiet, powerful success, attracts imitators. Within months, other organizations began releasing watered-down versions of her framework. One consultancy rolled out a program called Rebuild Pro, which borrowed her terminology, rebranded the message, and repackaged it for high-end clients. They charged thousands to license it, and proudly boasted it was inspired by grassroots reintegration. Emma watched it unfold with a mix of frustration and clarity. She didn't own the idea of second chances, but she knew when people were selling hope without the struggle that made it real. Still, she didn't sue. She didn't send cease and desists. She doubled down on authenticity. In a dusty auditorium in South Dakota, she gave a speech to 50 parolees trying to restart their lives. She didn't dress up. She didn't read off a slide. She spoke to them like people, told them about the time she was laughed out of a room for wearing old shoes, about how some of the most dangerous barriers were the ones you couldn't see. Assumptions, expectations, the silence when no one says your name because they've already decided you don't matter. And then, as the sun dipped below the windows, she gave them something else. Job referrals, training access, a path forward, not one size fits all, real, tailored steps. Because she remembered what it felt like to be given vague advice dressed up as opportunity, and she refused to pass that pain forward. By the end of the week, 5 attendees had already enrolled in upskilling programs. 2 landed apprenticeships. 1 wrote her a letter with tear-mudged ink. "You made me feel like a human again." Meanwhile, back in the city, the foundation had begun drawing interest from policymakers. One senator requested a briefing on the Second Horizon model, not for optics, but because her state had one of the highest unemployment rates for older workers and displaced veterans. Emma was cautious. She didn't trust politics. But she showed up. She presented the data, brought in graduates to speak, and quietly left the materials on the table. She didn't ask for funding. She asked for room. The next quarter, legislation was introduced offering tax incentives for companies that adopted verified reintegration programs. It wasn't named after Emma. It didn't need to be. The work spoke for itself. But she wasn't untouched by fatigue. Late nights added up. So did the weight of being a symbol. One night, while reviewing a regional budget proposal, she put her head down on her desk and just stayed there. Not asleep, not defeated, just still. For the first time in years, the drive in her legs gave way to the ache in her back. Daniel found her that way. He knelt beside her chair and said nothing, just placed a hand on her shoulder, warm and grounding. She finally whispered, "What if I'm not enough to hold it all?" He answered without hesitation, "You're not supposed to. You were never building something for one person to carry. You lit the fire. Now let them bring the wood." She sat up, exhaled, and nodded. The next day, she did something she hadn't done before. She called in leaders from every state-level program that had adopted her model and told them, "You don't answer to me. You answer to the people you're lifting. Lead like it matters, because it does." She wasn't looking to be the center. She was trying to disappear into the ripple. If you've ever worked yourself to the bone for something bigger than you, if you've ever pushed through exhaustion because quitting meant someone else might be left behind, then you already understand Emma's fire. Like, comment, and subscribe for more stories where ordinary grit becomes extraordinary change, and where the legacy lives in those who pick up the torch next. Months later, in a sleepy town nestled between cornfields and train tracks, Emma walked through the doors of a job placement center that had once been a condemned public library. The walls still smelled faintly of mildew, the paint chipped along the corners, but the room was buzzing with new energy. Folding chairs were set up in rows, laptops hummed on scratched-up tables, and volunteers from the Second Horizon Initiative moved between groups of people. Some just released from incarceration, others long-time residents returning after layoffs, all of them overlooked by the old system. This wasn't a press stop. There were no reporters, no donors watching, just the work. Emma moved quietly, talking to people one by one. A man named Curtis, mid-50s, missing 2 front teeth, had just finished his first-ever resume. He held it like it was made of gold. A woman named Tanya, once a stay-at-home mother of 4, was finishing her final module in a logistics certification course. She hugged Emma like family. These weren't statistics. These were names, stories, lives in motion. And Emma understood that each one was another brick in the foundation she was laying. Not the kind you step on, but the kind you stand with. Back at headquarters, her team was preparing a year-end report. They wanted to highlight the milestones, frame it for the media push that would follow. But Emma stopped them. "No glossy charts," she said. "Tell me how many people bought groceries this week because of this work. Tell me how many parents didn't have to choose between gas and dinner." She rewrote the introduction herself. It started with a single line. This isn't a success story. This is what happens when people are seen. Her words were spreading farther than she knew. That same week, a journalist from an international outlet flew in unannounced, requesting an interview. They didn't want a studio, they wanted to follow her through a day. Emma said yes, but warned them it's not glamorous. The next morning, the reporter found her hauling donated office chairs out of a van and into a startup workspace she was helping open, in the heart of a rural manufacturing zone. No staff entourage, no staged photo ops, just Emma, wind in her hair, sleeves rolled, smiling between breaths. "You could be running a national office by now," the reporter said, half joking. "Why are you still here carrying chairs?" Emma looked up, squinting against the sun. "Because this is where change actually happens. Not in speeches, not in offices with glass doors, right here, between what's broken and what's possible." The story went viral anyway, but her rise wasn't without shadows. That winter, Emma received a letter, no return address. Inside was a single-page printout with her face circled in red ink. Below it, in crude block letters, the words, "You don't belong here, stop pretending." She stared at it for a long time, not because she was afraid, but because the old pain it triggered surprised her. She had thought those wounds were healed, the ones from being dismissed, mocked, underestimated, but fear, she realized, doesn't vanish. It learns to wait. She folded the letter once, placed it in a drawer, and returned to work. She didn't mention it to Daniel until later that night. They were sitting on the porch, winter air cutting across their faces, wrapped in old blankets, watching steam curl from their mugs. "Got another letter," she said casually. He didn't react right away, just stared out at the stars, then finally said, "You know what that means?" She raised an eyebrow. "Means the noise is louder than ever, and the people who built the walls you tore down, they're starting to hear the cracks." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Good." The next morning, she walked into a meeting with representatives from 6 regional employers and presented them with a new challenge, not just to hire from re-entry pools, but to start shifting internal leadership. "You don't change the future by giving people jobs," she said. "You change it by letting them lead." It wasn't a request. It was a line in the sand. Some flinched. Others stepped forward. One CEO stood and said, "What would that look like practically?" Emma didn't hesitate. "It looks like Curtis, like Tanya, like every person who's carried more weight than you'll ever see on a resume. Train them, invest in them, and get out of their way." By the end of the month, 3 companies had started leadership tracks based on her model. But Emma didn't slow down. She visited every pilot location in person, stayed late at workshops, answered questions from candidates herself. One night, as she packed up folding chairs in a church basement in Michigan, a teen girl approached her with hesitation. "My mom says you're gonna get famous," the girl said. Emma smiled softly. "I hope not," she replied. "I just want the work to outlive the spotlight." If you've ever kept going after the cheers faded, if you've pressed on through resistance, threats, or fatigue because the mission mattered more than your name, then you've already walked in Emma's shoes. Like, comment, and subscribe for more stories where the mission speaks louder than the fame. And the builders never stop building, no matter who's watching. Spring arrived slowly, bleeding color back into the concrete gray cities Emma had spent the past year moving through. Trees budded in schoolyard corners, sidewalk chalk returned to curbs. And in cities, towns, and neighborhoods once written off by policymakers and corporate maps, something else had begun to bloom. Hope in motion. One community center in Ohio celebrated its first full cohort of re-entry grads, nearly all of whom had landed jobs before their certification ended. A small machine shop in Arkansas expanded its team by 40%, hiring people with resumes that would have once been tossed aside. But more importantly, those people were now shaping policy from the inside. They were becoming mentors, managers. Emma watched it all unfold, not from behind a podium, but from the road. She lived out of a suitcase now, not because she had to, but because she chose to be there, in every place where the needle was finally starting to move. Her team grew, her board expanded, and still, Emma personally reviewed every new location proposal. She wasn't trying to build an empire, she was building a web. something resilient, something that didn't collapse when one string was cut. One morning, while eating breakfast in a worn-out motel in Kansas, Emma's phone buzzed. It was a message from a hiring manager who had once doubted her program entirely. He'd been one of her earliest skeptics, openly vocal about how emotional hires would sink productivity. His message read simply, "I was wrong. We promoted our first re-entry candidate today. He saved a failing contract. Thank you." She didn't gloat. She just replied, "Make sure you tell him that." That was the entire point. She didn't need credit. She needed momentum. Meanwhile, at the Foundation's home office, something unexpected was brewing. The board had received an award nomination, one of the most prestigious global recognitions in humanitarian innovation. Emma hadn't even known they submitted for it. When she found out, she didn't react with excitement. She paused, closed the email, and walked outside into the early sun. She stood barefoot in a patch of grass behind the building and breathed. Because part of her didn't want it. Awards meant attention. Attention meant scrutiny. She hadn't started any of this for applause. But something Daniel said years ago came back to her now. Sometimes visibility isn't for you. It's for the ones still waiting to be seen. She agreed to attend the ceremony on one condition, that her team, her graduates, and her partners would be part of the presentation. She wasn't going to be a solo act. The night of the awards, the event was held in a soaring hall lined with velvet curtains and chandeliers that looked like they belonged in a castle. Industry leaders filled the seats. Cameras clicked like insects. When Emma was announced, a hush fell. She walked up to the stage in a navy suit she'd worn a dozen times, flanked by 3 people. Curtis, the warehouse manager, Tanya, now a regional logistics supervisor, and Deja, a single mom who had just opened her own training facility in Emma didn't deliver a grand speech. She handed the mic to each of them. Curtis talked about fear, how the first time he stepped into a company meeting, he was certain they'd realize he didn't belong. But they didn't, he said, because Emma saw past the dust. Tanya spoke next, holding back tears. "I used to apologize every time I talked. Now people take notes when I speak." Deja finished strong. "This isn't a charity, this is strategy. We're not broken. We were just waiting on the right kind of fuel." The room rose in standing ovation before Emma even stepped forward. When she did, she simply said, "You've heard what this is. So I'll just say this. Let this not be the peak. Let this be the launch." Afterward, as people mingled and posed for photos, Emma stepped away to the edge of the balcony, looking out at the city's skyline. Daniel joined her, a glass in his hand. "That was something," he said. She nodded. "But there's still more." "Always more," he said with a quiet smile. "Yes," she replied, "always more." Because Emma had never been chasing one victory. She'd been building a movement that could live without her. An idea whose roots ran deeper than any award, whose seeds would outlast every headline. If you've ever looked at a world that felt unfair and decided to build something better anyway, if you've ever watched a wall go up and dared to carve out a door, then this is your story too. Like, comment, and subscribe for more stories where quiet revolutionaries leave loud legacies, and where the world begins to shift because someone like you stood up and said, "Not anymore." After the award ceremony, Emma returned home for the first time in weeks. Not just to her city, but to the modest 2-bedroom house where it all began. The one where she used to sit at the kitchen table in silence, wondering if anyone would ever take her seriously. The house hadn't changed much. The curtains were still uneven. The old couch still sagged on one side. But the silence inside it had changed. It was no longer filled with doubt. It pulsed with something steadier. A kind of peace that only comes after walking through fire, and not just surviving it, but shaping it. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat on the back porch, where the wind was soft and the air smelled like coming rain. She looked out over the small yard, remembering the first night she'd returned from that humiliating interview. The night Daniel had offered her coffee without a word. The night she decided not to give up. Now, here she was. Thousands of hires later, dozens of programs launched, and a foundation growing faster than anyone could track. Daniel stepped out beside her, 2 mugs in hand. He sat down without speaking. They'd done this so many times, just sitting in the quiet after long days. No applause, no cameras, just 2 people who built something together, in different ways, but with the same fire. She looked over at him. "I think I'm ready to write it all down," she said softly. He didn't ask what she meant. "Not a book," she added, "a manual? For the next ones? The ones who are going to take it further than I ever could?" He nodded, smiling. "Good. They'll need it." And so she did. For the next few weeks, Emma stepped out of the spotlight and into the work of reflection. She dug through notes, interviews, pilot data, letters from graduates. She wrote late into the night, not with polished prose but with brutal honesty. The parts that failed, the things she wished she'd done sooner, the mistakes that taught her more than the wins ever could. She titled the document, "The Open Path," building what they said was impossible. She made 1 copy, printed it, bound it herself. Then she walked into a training session at a small facility in Indiana, just another hub that had adopted the Second Horizon model. She sat in the back as a new instructor gave a lecture on adaptive leadership. The instructor didn't know she was there. She watched a woman in her 40s answer a case study question like a strategist. She watched a teenager, barely out of high school, offer a solution that left the room in awe. And when it ended, she quietly walked up to the front and handed the instructor the manual. "No rush," she said. "Just pass it on when you've finished." She didn't sign it. She didn't tell them who she was. She walked out before they could thank her. Later that month, she received a letter. Handwritten, no email, no tweet, just ink on paper. It was from a man in Montana who had read about her journey in a local paper. He was a former welder turned community coach. His words were simple. "I didn't know people like us were allowed to lead. You made me rethink everything." Emma pinned the letter above her desk. That same week, a high school senior emailed her, asking how to get involved. He'd grown up watching his mother work 3 jobs and still be told she wasn't skilled enough for anything better. "I want to build what you built," he wrote. Emma didn't send him a generic reply, she called him. They spoke for 40 minutes. She gave him a list of books, offered to introduce him to one of her field trainers, and ended the call by saying, "Don't build what I build what you see coming next." Because Emma never wanted to be the story, she wanted to be the spark. Her name was still being said in important rooms. Her photo still circulated in business magazines. But her favorite moments were the ones no one saw. When a mentor texted her to say one of their students just got a job offer, or when she sat in a dusty hallway with someone trying to believe they still had value after being forgotten for so long. If you've ever known that the most powerful things are the ones done without witnesses, if you've ever passed on what you learned not for praise, but because someone once gave you that chance, then you already carry what Emma spent her life trying to ignite. Like, comment, and subscribe for more stories where the fire never belongs to just one person, and the real legacy is how many hands it lights next. It was a warm afternoon when Emma stood beneath the quiet sky at a small dedication ceremony in a town few people could place on a map. No stage, no suits, just folding chairs on a patch of cleared land where a new training center was being built, not by a corporation or a city grant, but by the very people who would one day learn inside it. Re-entry graduates had designed it. Local volunteers had poured the concrete. Formerly incarcerated men and women, single parents, veterans, all of them now carpenters, planners, project leads. They didn't need Emma to speak. They'd asked her just to be present. She stood off to the side, sunglasses shielding her eyes, heart full but quiet. A boy ran past her laughing, his mother, Tanya, waving at him to slow down. Nearby, Curtis shook hands with a state official who once doubted whether any of this was sustainable. Emma watched it all unfold like a story she'd once imagined, but now had the privilege to witness. This wasn't a program anymore. It was a living, breathing movement. Self-sustaining, self-spreading. Someone tapped her shoulder. It was Deja, now the director of one of the largest Second Horizon branches. "They want you to place the last tile," she said. Emma chuckled, almost embarrassed. "I think you've all done more than enough without me." But Deja just smiled. Come on, one more piece, then you can finally sit down. Emma walked over and took the small square of clay in her hand. It had been hand-painted by a local child, a red flame inside a circle, the first logo ever drawn for Project Reentry. She knelt down, placed the tile into its frame at the entryway, and pressed it firmly into the adhesive. A perfect fit. As she stood, the crowd clapped, not for a show, but because they knew what it meant. They knew she'd started something they would finish. That evening, long after the laughter had faded and the tools had been packed away, Emma sat alone at a small bench just outside the site. She listened to the crickets, watched the sun drop below the trees. She pulled out her phone and opened a message from a woman named Rosa in Arizona. Rosa had been rejected from over 100 jobs after taking years off to care for her aging parents. Through the Second Horizon app, she'd applied again. This time, through a re-entry certified company, she got the job. Her message said, "I don't know who you are really, but thank you. You made someone like me visible again." Emma smiled, then replied, "You were always visible. They just didn't look hard enough." Back home, Daniel was waiting with dinner and a quiet smile. They sat in the kitchen, the same old wooden table between them, where it had all started. He reached across, took her hand, and asked, "You think it'll keep going?" Emma nodded. "It already is." Then she paused, looking at him with that half smirk that always came before something bold. "And maybe, just maybe, it's time I go back to school." Daniel blinked. "School?" She laughed. "Yeah. I've spent a decade proving degrees aren't everything. Maybe it's time I earn one anyway. Just for me." He raised his glass. "To doing things on your terms." They clinked quietly, the sound small but lasting. Years from now, her name would be cited in textbooks, used in classrooms, referenced in articles about system disruption and social innovation. But she wouldn't be there for the accolades. She'd be in the back of a workshop, helping someone fill out a job application, or in a crowded room listening more than speaking, or maybe walking quietly through a facility someone else had built using the foundation she'd left behind. Her face might fade, but her fingerprints never would. Because Emma never set out to be remembered. She set out to make remembering unnecessary, for no one to ever be forgotten in the first place. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of someone who was passed over, talked down to, or told their time had passed, then let that fire live on in you. Like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that prove the power of persistence, the strength of unseen heroes, and the unstoppable force of someone who finally gets the chance to be seen. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person who refuses to shrink. And if you're that person, the world won't know what hit it.